Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the second session of this tremendously interesting and very important day-long symposium on the Holocaust in Hungary. This panel is entitled Remembering the Holocaust in Post-Communist Hungary. I'll be chair and also respondent to it. My name is Paul Hanebrink. I'm Associate Professor of History and Jewish Studies at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And like many of the panelists here, I've been a fellow at the wonderful Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. I was a fellow in 1999 and 2000. We have three presenters. If you look on your program, you will see four names. Unfortunately, Zoltán Vági could not join us today. But we do have with us the other three presenters, and I'll just introduce them very briefly in order, all three at once, and then I'll ask them to come up to the podium to make their presentations in the order that you see on the program. So our first presenter will be Árpád from Klimó, who is Associate Professor of History at Catholic University. He'll be speaking on the Catholic Church, Nationalism, and Antisemitism in Hungary since 1989. Our second presenter will be Jeffrey Murer, who is lecturer at the University of St. Andrews, who will be speaking on anti-Semitism and anti-Roma politics in the contemporary Hungarian radical right. And our final presenter will be Zoltán Tibori Szabó, who is Senior Scientific Researcher and Associate Professor in the Department of Political, Administrative, and Communication Sciences at the Babes-Bolyai University of Cluj-Napoca in Romania. And he'll be speaking on the Holocaust in Transylvania. So without any further ado, let me again welcome you all, and I'll ask Dr. von Klimó to make the first presentation.
Thank you very much, Paul. And I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I hope they don't regret it. And I would like to say hello to Budapest, too. I hope they don't regret it because I'm a historian and I have to talk about the time after 1989, the present period, which is awful for historians, because I don't know how the story would continue. That's really not very comfortable. The other problem is that there's not a lot of research on this topic, almost nothing. So this is really just an attempt to find out what is the relationship between the Catholic Church, nationalism, and anti-Semitism in Hungary since 1989. I was expecting when I started to do this research that, or better I should say, I was posing this question, is there a relationship, is there anti-Semitism in the Catholic Church in Hungary today? Because there is a tradition and there was a close relationship between Catholic intellectuals and anti-Semitism in the interwar period. I just have to name two leading Catholic intellectuals, Bishop Ottokar Prohászka and Father Béla Bangha, who were very important figures in Hungarian Catholicism. They were the symbols almost of Catholic renewal in the interwar period. And they were among the most outspoken intellectuals of anti-Semitic ideas. And even if there's a fact that Ottokar Prohászka died in 1927, so there's also a historical twist to that. Still, there's this idea that Catholicism formulated in Hungary especially, but also in other places, formulated a critique of modernity that was closely related to anti-Semitic ideas. And I will give a few examples for today. My paper is very long, so I will only summarize it here because I only have 20 minutes minus the 2 minutes that I already took. So what I did was, first of all, I looked at, okay, what does anti-Semitism today mean? What does Catholic anti-Semitism, if there is such, mean? Second part of my paper is, what does the Catholic Church say, the representatives? So by doing research, and in this case, of course, it's a lot of internet research because I'm dealing with today, and that's the first place where you have to look at. That's the archive of nowadays. I stumbled upon a blog that's called the Sober Catholic, or in Hungarian it's józankatholikus.hu. And it's, which means something like moderate Catholic or modest or something. A person called József Bálint, who introduced himself as a middle-class, educated Hungarian, is speaking about his ideas of Catholicism here, and he, in many of his blogs, he becomes very much involved in anti-Semitic ideas. So in 2003, in a response to George Kish, which was a priest of Jewish background, who had written about the complicated relationship between anti-Semitism and the Catholic Church, József Bálint wrote the following, I quote, "20 years ago, I didn't know anything about Jews. I protested against the Communist Party's doctrine that Israel occupies Palestine rightful territory." So his narrative begins as a story of conversion. He says, I was very naive and I didn't know a lot about the world before 1989. And then it changed. So that's what happened. He says, after 1989, after the Rendszerváltás, the change of systems in Hungary, quote, I lost my earlier idealism. And then he says, well, I condemned the deportation of the Jews in 1945, but I was always against collective guilt. I only accepted individual guilt, unquote. And then he goes on, quote, the Jews, no matter whether they thanked for my solidarity before 1989, started to ridicule and humiliate me. They talked about my culture as if it was only a peasant's underwear and apricot schnapps culture, unquote. And then he says, after 1989, there's a campaign by the Jews, and he goes on to describe this, saying that, another quotation, they laughed about my pain because of Trianon. They invented all kinds of accuses against me. Somehow they built up arguments. If you love your country, if it hurts you, when they call the Holy Crown a bear cap, then you are a fascist animal, unquote. So he feels personally attacked by the Jews. And then he says, and they are very clever, of course. Next quotation. Of course, these statements didn't come from religious Jews, but the non-religious Jews are also Jews like Hungarians are Hungarians, and he always makes clear Jews cannot be Hungarians. Hungarians, if they are Reformed Catholic or atheists, they fabricated these statements with such a devilish cleverness that often they didn't seem at first glance to have Jewish authors, unquote. So here it's very clear that even if a statement doesn't come obviously from a Jew, it must be Jewish somehow. So that's the problem of an anti-Semite who doesn't even need Jews to be against them. His statement shows that an anti-Semitic worldview is shielding himself against arguments that would, or against contradicting evidence. Jeffrey will talk much more profoundly about the psychological and sociological, basically, functions of anti-Semitism. So I don't have to go into detail on that. The blogger also has a certain worldview. he explains after 1989, then there was the parties of the Jews of Hungary, Magyar Országi Zsidók, and he says, of course, that was the Federation of Free Democrats, the SDS, who, according to him, had, quote, a slogan, everything which is bad for the Hungarians, we will propagate and follow and strengthen. And he gives some keywords: state taxes, strangers that can buy Hungarian real estate, drug policy, defense, education, and the popularization of gay rights, unquote. So there are really popular topics of today's anti-Semitism and also anti-Western ideas that are here mixed together in this blog. What I found interesting is that he claimed that Jews also were responsible for all the catastrophes of Hungarian history since the 19th century. Of course, Trianon very prominently, but also communism was a Jewish fabrication. Capitalism is a Jewish fabrication. I mean, I don't have to go into details. It's very common ideas. What I found interesting is that he also said in some of his writings that he had lived in West Germany during the 1980s, and he witnessed how there the Jewish influence became like a tyranny over Germany, and Germans are not allowed to say anymore what they want, otherwise they will be punished as right-wing extremists. So, and now Hungary is the next victim of this conspiracy. That's his world of thinking. So I wanted to find out how representative is this for the Catholic Church or Catholicism in Hungary today. And very positively, I found out it's not. It's a very extreme position, and it's very rare that we find representatives of the Catholic Church who express similar ideas. I will give one example later, but most of all, this is very extreme and very also, most of all, outside the teaching of the Catholic Church, especially since the Second Vatican Council. So this person is very typical of a segment of society that, according to András Kovács, is his newest study, is mostly middle-aged men who live in the countryside, most of all. They are disproportionately represented among anti-Semites. And there's also people who try to understand why is that so. And a lot of this has to do with 1989, with the extreme disappointments that came with the end of communism. And a lot of this frustrations and aggression became connected to anti-Semitism in this group. I think I will go on, and Kovács in his study found out that people who are more religious than the average person in Hungary are less anti-Semitic. Quotation: anti-Semitism is significantly stronger among those who did not enter a confession or a religious group at the time they were born, who do not participate in religious life, who are not tied to any confession, who are not religious, or who cannot respond to the question whether they are religious, so they don't even know. Compared to these, those who identify with a confession, who participate more than just symbolically in religious life, or who are religious in their own way, show less anti-Semitic prejudices. There is no significant diversion between the different confessions, which is also interesting, with regard to the ratio of prejudices, and among those who follow the teachings of the Church or who are practicing religion seriously, but also those who are conscious atheists. So all these people who have a very strong religious belief or atheistic orientation are less frequent among anti-Semites. I found that very interesting. And anti-Semitism is very more common among people who are not religiously bounded. And I think one of the explanations for this is that probably that people who are involved in a religious community have maybe less orientation problems that could be explained by anti-Semitism. Now, my second part, the second part of my paper. What does the Catholic Church and their representatives say? As I emphasized at the beginning, representatives of the Catholic Church in Hungary are not involved in anti-Semitic discourse, or only very exceptionally. The official standpoint of the Church in Hungary, which has to do with the changes on religious teaching and the teaching on Jews. There's this wonderful book by John Connolly, From Enemy to Brother, which shows the complicated history of the Second Vatican Council and the changes in the teaching about Judaism within Catholicism. This has altered the standpoint of the Catholic Church. The representatives of Catholicism in Hungary had mostly followed these changes of the world church. So I give a couple of examples. First of all, in Hungarian Catholic publications such as the Magyar Courier, the daily semi-official Catholic newspaper of Hungary, and in other official statements of bishops, we will find statements which condemn anti-Semitism, especially after the visit of Blessed John Paul II, Pope in Hungary in 1992, who had visited the country and said, then the Hungarian Conference of Bishops released an official statement against anti-Semitism and racial discrimination, in which the bishops declared, quote, "With concern, we are observing all radical manifestations in the world and in our country in which racial discrimination or anti-Semitism appear. These are not just unjust discriminations in social life, but also causes of serious conflicts. The general ethical law excludes racial discrimination in every form. The Christian teaching, in addition, proclaims that everyone is God's creature in the same way, and that the commandment to love every man does not allow any exception," unquote. So a very clear statement. The Hungarian primate, the head of the church, Archbishop Péter Erdő of Budapest, has constantly denounced anti-Semitism. And the blogger that I mentioned before, Balint, was hinting at this. He said Holocaustosálás would enter the church, meaning playing the Holocaust card. That's a term anti-Semites use for a use of Holocaust for political means. And he was referring, I guess, to Péter Erdő. During the 2012 Budapest March of the Living, Péter Erdő stated that, quote, "Christianity is not compatible with anti-Semitism. It is not compatible with hate-mongering and with the inflaming of tempers against any religious community, against any ethnic group. Anti-Semitism is not compatible with humanity. I hope we can defeat it if we all join forces and if we all want this. If we agree that the hatred, the anti-Semitic, the racist speech and deed is always poisonous," unquote. Peter Feldmayer, the president of the Federation of Jewish Communities in Hungary, commented on this, quote, "Jews used to feel some hostility from some Catholic clergy," he said, "but that faded away after Erdő became Archbishop of Budapest a decade ago." there's more examples. What's also interesting is that Péter Erdő is now working very closely with other church leaders, Gustav Bölschke from the Reformed Church and Peter Gansch from the Lutherans. And together they published statements, for instance, April 2012, against Zsolt Borác's advanced of the 1882 blood libel claim of Tisza Esler. It was mentioned this morning. What is also interesting in the Catholic Church since 1989 was the canonization of Sister Sára Salkóházy, a nun who was killed by Arrow Crossmen because she hid Jews in her home in Budapest. It was called a working women's home in Budapest, an institution that she had founded with others of the Sisters of Social Service. This canonization that took place in 2006 was the first canonization, the first beatification in Hungary since King Stephen was canonized almost 1,000 years ago. So you see that a martyr of the Holocaust, a Catholic martyr, became a very important central figure for Catholicism in Hungary today. Another high clergy who is very engaged in the condemnation of anti-Semitism and in the Christian-Jewish dialogue is Bishop Osztrik Várszegi, the abbot of Pannonhalma, which is the most important monastery in Hungary. So these examples which I mentioned show that the Hungarian church leadership, and together with the Vatican, are very clear in their condemnation of anti-Semitism and racism today, which is a very strong difference to the time before the Vatican Council, and most of all before 1945. I looked at, so anti-Semitism was not an issue with regard to the leadership of the Catholic Church. I looked at nationalism. What is the approach the Catholic Church takes with reference to Trianon, which is a nationalist topic that is sometimes also used by anti-Semites in their ideas. In June 2010, the government of Viktor Orbán and the Hungarian parliament, dominated by his party, celebrated the first day of national togetherness, commemorating Trianon. After the official ceremony in parliament, Cardinal Erdő celebrated a mass in St. Stephen's Basilica in Budapest, which was dedicated to the renewal of the national spirit. And it was followed by speeches of representatives of the Lutheran Church, the Reformed churches, and the Jewish community. So it was a commemoration that brought different, at least the four largest religious communities together. The speech was also very much tending towards integration. And there's another bishop in Kaposvár, Béla Balázs. He also participated in a celebration or in the memory of Trianon. In his speech following the inauguration of a monument, Bishop Balázs tried to combine appeals to a return to religious values with the appeal to not forget the nation. He said, quote, "Our homeland grants us security. It may embrace also those who are looking for a home or those who seek a refuge," unquote. So this, again, it's more about integration, and interestingly, this could also mean the embrace of immigrants to Hungary, which is a very Catholic idea, but I never heard of that in the Hungarian, in the history of Hungarian Catholicism. So it's very interesting, because you would think when they talk about Trianon, then they talk about an inclusive or an exclusive nation, but it seemed to be a very integrative approach. Okay, that was the positive part. Now the exception. While there were numerous attempts to condemn and reject anti-Semitism on the highest level of the Catholic Church in Hungary, it seems as if not all bishops are fully engaged in this effort. At the same time, when Archbishop Erdő was active in commemorating the Holocaust, in the summer months of 2012, Archbishop Gyula Márfi of Veszprém wrote a letter in English to an American professor at Lutheran University of Texas, David Baer. Paul knows David Baer. Baer, who had spent a lot of time in Hungary studying and finally protesting a new law on religious organizations, which he thought was limiting the religious freedom of smaller groups in Hungary. Baer was shocked by the content and tone of Archbishop Márfi's letter. In his letter, Márfi writes about how the Hungarian judiciary was full of former communists who were involved in show trials against the churches, and that the process of registration of religious organizations had to be pulled away from them. A claim that does not sound very plausible, since the last trials against religious organizations in Hungary date back to the 1970s, so I don't think that they are still around 40 years later. He portrays Viktor Orbán as a victim of former communists who are now capitalists, and they dominate the European Parliament, and they hate Viktor Orbán because he resisted their attempt to turn Europe into a hyper-liberal paradise of gays and lesbians. So we have some elements that are known from other contexts. Even worse, in the following part of his letter, the Archbishop slides more and more into the ideological realm of the world conspiracy against the Hungarian nation. I quote, "The leaders of leftist Europe over-prescribe freedom, which, similar to an overdose of medicine, doesn't cure but poisons. They would persecute the churches and religion." And then he goes on, "It is not only a European problem, but it also involves the United States, and most of all, international capital, whose owners must be found somewhere around New York's Wall Street. These owners of capital want to make the individual states their slaves through their loans." And again, we have this idea of a conspiracy. These people try to influence elections, and through their loans, they make smaller countries their colonies. We hear that, now I speak as a German, often from Greece and from other countries that had economic difficulties, let's say. So these capitalists are very angry at Viktor Orbán, according to Archbishop Márfi, because, quote, "he enacted several laws adversely affecting the international financiers," unquote. He names a few of these, and the supporters of the international capital. And it happens that most of these people are Jewish. Imre Kertész, Ákos Kertész, and others. Finally, he links this aggression against Hungary with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Quote, "The situation is well known. It was this way 2,000 years ago when the Rabbinical Council cooperated with Pontius Pilate. Pilate is still being applauded by all scribblers and Pharisees. And naturally, there are the false witnesses whose whole life consists only of lies, and because they own most of the media." So this is really very close to the anti-Semitic blogger that I found in the internet. I would like to conclude. Again, how can we explain this outbreak of blunt anti-Semitism and nationalism from a member of the high clergy in Hungary? He's an exception. I have to emphasize this. I would assume that it has to do with the fact that the Hungarian church was, after the brutal suppression and the violent persecution during the Stalinist years, and under János Kádár, then controlled, observed, and infiltrated by the State Office of Church Affairs and the Hungarian state security apparatus. And that's why the church has a problem. Many priests and most bishops had to collaborate with the dictatorship of the party. The not very successful attempts of the church to deal with this terrible legacy, they are still working on that, and it will take time, seem to weigh heavy on many clergy today. So I think, similar to also Prime Minister Viktor Orban, whose father was a party member, it seems as if the paranoid nationalism and anti-communism that we see here is a form of overcompensation and a way to distract from the complicated past of the church. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Murer.
Right. Well, thank you. Good afternoon. And I'd like to share my thanks, as all the other presenters have spoken, both to the Holocaust Museum, specifically to Professor Brom, to Leah Wolfson, to all of you for coming, and also to be simulcast to Budapest. So, köszönöm szépen. I'm actually going to talk about some of the questions that have come up so far, and to talk about the present, and to, in some regard, reverse the trajectory here and to move from the present back to the past, and to see the way that the past connects to the present. And as Professor Brom introduced in his opening statement, this idea of understanding the present through the past becomes one of the ways of justifying actions in the present by using the past, and so we'll make those linkages. The title of my paper references fantasies, and I'd like to speak about that for a moment, to see them as equivalences. That is, the idea that one thing is like another, or is exactly the same as another. And in a regard, my whole interest in this area came from a piece of graffiti I saw in 1990. Written on a wall, it said, Žydų SDS, right? Jews equal the Free Democrats. And here I'd like to just say that that equal sign works in two directions, and Árpád actually brought this up a little bit in his talk, and we'll explore it a little bit more here. But that the equation works in both directions. So the accusation in that piece of graffiti could most easily be read that somehow the people that were in the Alliance of Free Democrats were largely Jews. But I'd actually like to turn it around and actually say that those political opponents become Jews. And so this way of, as Árpád kind of mentioned, right, regardless of whether someone is Jewish or not, becomes incidental. In fact, it almost becomes completely irrelevant. In this fantasy of equivalencies, right, the enemy, the political opponent, becomes a Jew. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. So, almost exactly last year, on the 16th of March, 2013, people woke up at ELTE University, the most prominent university in Budapest, to stickers that were placed on the nameplates of prominent Jewish professors. Agnes Heller, a very, very prominent philosopher. She holds the Hannah Arendt Chair in Philosophy at the New School in New York. She herself is a Holocaust survivor. She and her mother weren't deported. And we find on her door that morning a sticker that says, Jews, the university is ours, not yours, regards the university students. Now, this is offensive on multiple levels. Of course, it's not only offensive to the personage of Agnes Heller as a survivor, and not only offensive to all survivors, but it references a number of different ideas. So one of the things that we see just in this tiny little sticker is not only a reference to the Holocaust, and as Gabor mentioned in his paper, and as we heard in some of the opening comments, that in 1938, there was a series of enactments of Jewish laws in Hungary that prohibited Jews from being in certain professions, that limited them to certain properties, that had all kinds of restrictions on them. But those 1938 laws that looked very much like the German Nuremberg laws were actually based on the numerous Clausus laws of 1920 that were actually founded by Horthy. In fact, Horthy very proudly said of the numerus clausus, "It is important to frighten the Jews, because otherwise they become insolent." This idea that Horthy himself was very pleased with these kind of restrictions of Jews being limited to professions, or in the case of the numerus clausus laws, only 6% of any university students could be Jewish, was suddenly a restriction that becomes quite prominent. And I'd actually say that that prominence is embedded in what Horthy called the Szeged idea, this idea of a Christian Hungary, again, that Árpád just had mentioned in his paper, whereby the true Hungarian, according to the Szeged idea, is a Christian Hungarian. And so here we have, this is actually the manifesto of the Jobbik party from 2010. This is their last manifesto. I'll show their present one in a moment. Unapologetically discussing radical change, but Jobbik, and it's an interesting play on words in Hungarian, the official, I don't know if you can see it at the bottom of the slide, but in English, they say that they're movement for a better Hungary. We can actually see Jobbik as somehow being better, but it's also a play being more to the right. It is the righter party. Now we can see that as also being more correct, right? But we can also see it as being more to the right on the political spectrum. And if we look here to this is their new slogan, "Speak out and solve problems," or solve is basically all it suggests here. But in their logo, we see clearly a cross. Now, I think this also goes hand in glove with Árpád's comments. These are not people who identify themselves as religious, but they do identify themselves as Christian. And in identifying themselves as Christian, they're explicitly saying that they're not Jewish. So in this regard, the true Hungarian in the Szeged idea, perhaps implicit here in this Jobbik logo, is that the true Hungarian, right, cannot be Jewish. And this idea of the insolent Jew or the untrustworthy Jew actually comes out from now Gyöngyösi, who's the Jobbik caucus leader in the parliament. He said in November 2012, right, "I think it's time to make a list," right, and to see how many Hungarian people of Jewish origin are living in Hungary, especially in the parliament or in the government, and they're a threat. Now, Gyöngyösi was taken out in the press for saying something so vehemently anti-Semitic, and he actually said, "Oh, well, actually, I was only talking about dual citizens with Israel," which actually doesn't seem to be much of an apology at all. But the idea that lists exist, I think, also goes back to the sticker from the Heller issue, because it was discovered almost immediately after Gyöngyösi had said this, that in ELTE, there was a student government, a student council, HUK, that was keeping a list of incoming students, recording whether they thought they were either Jewish or Roma. And this student council actually got to make subsidies for students. So in a sense, some students weren't receiving subsidies because they were perceived to be either Jewish or Roma. Zsolt Bayer, Fidesz co-founder, actually said of the gypsies that they are animals and they behave like animals, and let there be no more animals. Now, he too was excoriated in the press, and rightfully so, but I think it becomes interesting to see the kind of use of language that becomes very, very free and perhaps fluid. And in fact, then János Volner, the Jobbik spokesman, said that Bayer was right? That he was right to compare the Roma community to animals, and that the issue of gypsy crime needs to be resolved once Jobbik is in power. Now, this becomes a very interesting concept, and one that I'd like to discuss more in the paper, which is this connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Roma politics in the current moment. In some sense, we can see, as we heard throughout the papers this morning, that these are two parts of the Holocaust, right? That the Holocaust against Hungarian Roma and against Roma in all of Central Europe is a vicious one, equally vicious to the Jewish Holocaust. But I think there's more going on than just an echo of the processes of the Holocaust here, but rather to see the fantasy of two things being joined together. So in a statement from the Hungarian National Front, there's a virtual bulldozer of our country, a bulldozing that's destroying our country. The blade of the bulldozer is made up of gypsy criminals, and the driver is the Zionist Jewry. And this kind of connection between gypsy crime is an extremely offensive term, but the idea of petty crimes and small crimes are the echoes of what are these large capitalist crimes or large capitalist takings that become repeated again and again. Now, earlier, Jobbik actually demonstrated how they might resolve this gypsy problem. And in the city of Tisza-Vasvári, the Jobbik mayor, Eric Fulip, founded the Csendersheg, the gendarmerie, which we had heard in this morning's comments, right, were largely responsible for rounding up Roma and Jews, particularly in the countryside, and delivering them for special treatment. The idea that there would be a car driving around Tisza with the words Csendersheg on it, I think is really quite powerful. Moreover, many people have appropriated this from the far right and happily say that they are the guardians of peace, the translation of the word, right, that they will take care of gypsy crime or Roma problems. Now, luckily, of course, the Jewish community was outraged and actually sued into court and finally was able to get Tisza from being able to implement this Csendersheg, but saying that the Csendersheg in Tisza evokes one of the darkest periods in Hungarian history, right? And it's designed to intimidate on explicit racist ideology. To see that connection, I think, is a powerful one. Now, Ilona Moritz, who's the director of the International Center of Journalism, commented to me recently that this idea of gypsy crime as a word was almost non-existent 10 years ago, and it has become almost completely ubiquitous today, and it circulates quite easily. And in fact, this was a campaign poster from Jobbik for the municipal elections back in 2010, so it's a little bit old. But the idea that they would strike out against gypsy crime, among other things being political corruption and some other things here, but referencing, right, a parasite that needs to be stamped out, the parasite dripping blood. We see, invocations of the most powerful kind. So let's talk a little bit more about who some of these people are. This is a rally from this past October when I was in Budapest. And let me just also say most of these photographs are my own. I'd actually like to say something about the Hungarian government just passed a law banning photographs of people not explicitly giving their consent. I would just like to say, for someone who's been photo documenting political activities in Hungary for the past 25 years, I'm quite disturbed by this, although actually I did have the consent of these people to take these photographs. But nevertheless, I think it's quite important that we can see what's going on. These people actually are from an organization that also, in many regards, was disbanded. This was a group called the Hungarian Guard, the Magyar Garda. It's now subsequently taken on many, many other names, but Gábor Vona, the founder of the Jobbik Party in 2007, created a direct action arm. And this direct action arm, the Hungarian Guards, they wear these uniforms, they evoke very paramilitary affectations. They wear the red and white scarf or red and white badge of Árpád's flag, which was actually a symbol that was identified with the arrow cross and is actually a proscribed symbol, but nevertheless they wear it quite proudly. But there are even more kind of further radical people. Zsolt Tiricsan, who's the leader of the outlaw army, used language that I would suggest was similar to Zsolt Bayer's, saying that by any means necessary, he was going to protect his species, and that he was a proud racist, and that he was going to defend it. Now, unfortunately, and this is actually a photo of him proudly wearing his Adolf Hitler T-shirt, but also to see this kind of very direct military look from the rest of the outlaw army, I think is quite powerful. And here, the T-shirt that is the skull and crossbones on the left is actually the symbol of the outlaw army. And just last month, on Valentine's Day, perhaps inappropriately enough, the Jobbik Party held a rally in a former synagogue in Esztergom, saying that they were in the synagogue because they should be able to have a rally wherever they like, and it was the outlaw army that provided the security for that event. So even though directly Gábor Vona was responsible for the creation of Magyar Garda, which is then, you can see the Hungarian National Guard on the right, that group, he's now also become associated with the outlaws' army. About 200 people from Jobbik in the former synagogue, about 100 protesters outside. And the question earlier about the role of survivors, very prominent protester was a survivor herself, who actually said to Agence France Presse that she was wearing the star that was given to her as a child, and the fact that she has to do that now upsets her terribly. The idea that survivors as activists, I think, is quite important. So in Debrecen, in this town, in Debrecen, there was then a series of protests by all these different organizations against gypsy crime, saying that they were going to root out gypsy crime, and that they chanted to some of the people in town that they were going to die. Now, if much of what I presented right now seems like an empty threat, or maybe it's just stylizing or perhaps symbolic violence, in 2008 to 2009, a small group of people who in the press were called the Death Squad, and 4 of them, to the credit of the Hungarian government, have been found guilty, 3 of whom have been sentenced to life imprisonment, 1 sentenced to 13 years imprisonment, carried out a systematic series of attacks on Roma houses and Roma villages. And in this town, in Tatar Szent György, in 2009, Árpád Kish and his brother István Kish went to this house. István hid in some bushes. Árpád Kish and Zsolt Pető attacked the house with firebombs, and this Roma family of 5, 3 children and 2 adults, ran out of the burning house where István Kish shot them. Unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, or the police were called almost immediately. But the unfortunate part was the police couldn't believe that someone would actually shoot anyone, and that clearly the father and the son who were actually killed by the gunshots must have been injured by nails falling out of the attic of the building. The police trudged through the snow. According to the court transcripts, actually some of the police officers actually urinated into the snow, thus destroying the crime scene, which they never took very seriously in the first place. So, there was a series of protests as well in a town called Gyöngyöspáta, and in this town, another group called Védelő, or Defense, decided that they would run military exercises in this village. And week after week, the far right came till finally some business people kind of evacuated the Roma population because they were so frightened for their safety. But this group and this photograph I think is quite important because we see 2 women here. And while most of the violence is done by men, I think it's also quite important that we start to ask questions about what are these fantasies doing? Why anti-Semitism? Why the form of anti-Roma discourse that it takes? And I'd actually like to suggest that we not think about violence as only being dyadic between perpetrator and victim, but that we actually think of it as triadic that includes an audience, that there's someone that witnesses the violence, but not to judge, say, whether the violence is legitimate or not, but to judge whether it's actually a reflection of a group. That is, are you upholding group values by committing violence? So, in some sense, some of this violence is done to impress other people of the group. So, from 2008 to 2011, I was the principal investigator of the European Survey of Youth Mobilization, and during which we actually interviewed 800 young people involved in quote-unquote radical politics in Central Europe, 400 of whom were in Budapest with the help of Tarki and other researchers in Hungary. But I want to point out 2 quick things in reference to some of our questionnaires. We asked people about their response to violence, whether their friends thought that physical force was necessary in political action. And what I'd like to point out on this top graph is that you can see the response rates are almost identical between men and women, 1 meaning not at all and 7 meaning a great deal. And we can see actually to a great deal those respondents saying physical force is necessary. I think my friends think that physical force is necessary. 30 women and 27 men thought so. In the lower graph, these are actually broken out by group, and we can actually see Jobbik supporters. Of the 49 Jobbik supporters that we interviewed, 46 of them said to the 7 level, and those were equal men and women. So here we can actually see the breakout of men and women also to, if the government is not listening, physical force may be necessary to garner their attention. In this sense, we can actually see the distinct difference between Jewish activists who think not at all, and Jobbik who think, yes, very much so. And in this regard, performing the violence becomes a better way of demonstrating one's commitment to the group. And here we can actually see across a whole range of political categories their participation, the green line being women and the purple line being men. You can see on the far right, Jobbik, they're identical. So, I'm just about to come to my last point here. what's going on with some of these fantasies? How can we understand what's happening where violence is a group identity? And this map showing Ginger right, I think is actually a quite interesting one, because many of you will recognize that this is actually a map of the Kingdom of Hungary prior to the Treaty of Trianon. And this idea that Trianon serves as a particular narrative for the far right is quite important. You'll see on T-shirts, right, the idea of a mutilated Hungary, these skeletal hands grabbing these previous pieces of Hungary, right, drifting them away, tearing the construction of Hungary apart, is a trope that becomes repeated again and again by many supporters of the far right, whether they're Jobbik voters or other supporters of these other groups that I mentioned. And I'd like to suggest that what's happening here is we actually see a proxy narrative for some of the losses that had occurred following 1989. Most of these people from the far right were vehement anti-communists. So they should be extremely happy that communism has ended. But it didn't end the way that they thought it was going to end. And in that sense, they need a way to talk about it without being able to admit defeat. And so we start to see a repetition of this Trianon narrative of the losses of Hungary that then become a narrative about the losses post-1989. And this idea of sacrifice, of crucifixion, of mutilation, of pain, as Árpád noted in his paper, right, becomes something quite serious. For many of them, it's the pain of the loss of a future that was supposed to be something that didn't happen at the end of communism. For others, it's the loss of the jobs or economic stability. For some, it's the loss of security. But what becomes tied up in this loss, right, is a way of speaking about it without having to admit it directly, to tie their personal loss to other losses. And so we see these images repeat again, again, and again. And this was actually at a Jobbik rally for the 1956 commemorations just in October. So this idea of equivalences, I think, are important. I'll finish on this note. The idea of, and I think Árpád had mentioned it just in his paper, that for many of these people, they see this victim, they see themselves as victims of an external force. They see a Jewish conspiracy everywhere. They see these capitalists as somehow controlling all kinds of things. And these equivalences, right, become a way of trying to find new support. But being the victim, right, becomes a way of actually absolving oneself of any responsibility. And so this question of, what's Horthy's responsibility? It is Horthy who has come up with the idea of the Szeged idea. And here we actually see a statue being commemorated last year to Horthy, right? And this is Laurent Hegedus, a very far right wing preacher. But this idea of celebrating Horthy as celebrating, right, the losses, I think becomes a very interesting narrative. And this repetition then of not only the symbols, but even the costumes, the stylizing these events becomes a way of stating identity. And in this, the Szeged idea means if you don't feel this pain, you can't be a true Hungarian. And so if you don't support the new German occupation memorial, but moreover, if you actually don't support the removal of the Soviet memorial in Szabadság tér in Freedom Square that has been proposed, then you must support the Soviets, because otherwise you would want to see this go. And I think it becomes a very interesting way of seeing these equivalences of who, right, is a true Hungarian and who is not. Thank you. And this is the first slide, by the way.
Thank you. And our final presenter will be Dr. Zoltán Tibori Szabó.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor for me to speak in front of you and to deliver my presentation at this conference organized by the Holocaust Museum and the Rosenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. So I will be the last person for today to express my gratitude to Director Shapiro and to Professor Braham for inviting me here. I also owe many thanks to Dr. Leah Wolston and Nicole Frechette for their excellent organizational skills and work in bringing me here from Romania. Thank you. My presentation is about the Holocaust in Transylvania, and since the time of my presentation already gone, I will summarize a little bit. So I would like to share with you some of my views about the different phases of the Holocaust in Transylvania, as well as about the questions these different phases are raising. Yeah, probably I have to go back. So I will pass on the golden age of the Jews of Hungary, because Gabor Kadar already mentioned the Jewish emancipation law, and he discussed it in details, the reception law of the Israelite religion. After the First World War and the Peace Treaty of Trianon, Transylvania belonged to Romania until 1940. So this 20 years between the Treaty of Trianon and the so-called Second Vienna Award was an interesting period for those minorities, including the Jews living in Transylvania. Between 1924 and 30, a growing anti-Semitism was a problem in Romania. Attacks of Legion of Archangel Michael, later called the Iron Guard, a fascist movement in Romania, against Jewish communities living in Transylvanian towns such as Oradea, Huedin, Cluj, and so on. In 1934, Romanian parliament and government adopted the first anti-Semite law in Romania, a sort of pendant of the numerus clausus law of Hungary of 1920. 80% of the employees and 50% of the members of the company boards had to be Romanian ethnics. This was a law, an anti-Jewish law, of course. In January 21, 1938, the Romanian parliament adopted the decree law withdrawing the citizenship of several hundreds of thousands of Jews of Romania, and finally, during the last year of this Transylvania belonging to Romania, in August 1940, just a few days before the Second Vienna Award, it was adopted the so-called Statute of Jews in Romania, which was affecting the majority of Jews living in Romania and becoming, under this law, second-rank citizens of the country. The Second Vienna Award was a very important moment after the failure of the Romanian-Hungarian bilateral negotiations in Turnu Severin during July 1940. The two parties requested international decision regarding Transylvania. It is very important that Germany and Italy decided to return a part of the province, the northern Transylvanian part, to Hungary, and this decision was accepted and implemented by both parties. I would like to briefly show you the counties which were returned to Hungary. We have here the so-called four secular countries, Marostor, Dacsik, Udvarhely, Háromszék, so the secular land. And we have here Beszterce, Máramaros, Szatmár, Szilágy, Szolnok-Doboka, Kolos, Bihar. Máramaros is an interesting example because parts of the Máramaros county belonging to Romania before, together with parts of Soviet Union territory, will form the later Máramaros county in Hungary. The same is for Ugocsa county, which half of it was belonging to Romania until 1940 and another half to Czechoslovakia. And we have here Bereg and Ung counties together with three special administrative territories which were forming the scene, the historical scene for what I will say later. So Northern Transylvania, which returned to Hungary, had 43,000 square kilometers with 2.5 million inhabitants, including 151,000 persons of Israeli faith, according to the census in 1941, and 14,000 other individuals considered Jews under enacted Hungarian racial legislation. Total number of people considered to be of Jewish origin by 1941 on the territory returned to Hungary in 1940 August was 164,000 persons. We have here a distribution on the Northern Transylvanian map of the Jewish communities living. You have here the greatest community, the biggest community in the, except Budapest, of course, in the Hungarian, in the Northern Transylvanian Hungarian part, Nagyvárad or Oradea. We have here Szatmárnémeti, Máramaros-sziget, and Kolozsvár, of course, the capital town of Transylvania. We have now a possibility to divide the certain phases of the Holocaust in Northern Transylvania and to express that's my personal opinion. I can see four phases of the Holocaust in Northern Transylvania. The first phase is that of abuses and expulsions. A second phase is that of Holocaust by bullets, which took place here as well. The third phase, the extermination by forced labor, hunger, and disease. The third one and the fourth one, gas chambers, cremation, and slave labor being the total destruction phase of the Northern Transylvanian Jewish community. I summarized here for you some of the most important actions on each of these phases. During the first phase, the deportation from the so-called secular land during October-December 1940 was a direct responsibility of the Hungarian government and army, because Hungarian army organized these deportations mainly from Csíkszereda and other territories, other settlements on the secular land. Organized by Hungarian army, the number of affected families, approximately 64, exactly 64, but approximately 300 persons only in Csíkszereda. By that time, all of them were Hungarian subjects, not foreign subjects, their great majority being born in Hungary or in Romania, and according to the Treaty of Trianon, they were Romanian, respectively Hungarian citizens. And this treaty was then adopted as a special point in the Second Vienna Award, stating that all those people who had Romanian or Hungarian citizenship will become on the Hungarian territory Hungarian citizens. So they deported those families, tried to force them to cross the border to Romania. After the operation failed, the survivors were transported to Körösmező and forced to cross the border to the Soviet territories throughout the Tartar or Tatar pass. Some of the deportees managed to return to the Hungarian territories. Others were caught by the Soviet border guards, and finally 21 people disappeared. One of them, a survivor, I had the opportunity to interview him, declared that those were the lucky persons who were frozen to death during the first days, or were eaten by wild animals, because all the rest were caught by Soviet border guards and took to Ukrainian on Ukrainian territory to different ghettos, and they were freed only in 1945 or later. The total number of victims, according to the Cluj People Tribunal prosecutor, were approximately 200 in this phase of the Northern Transylvanian Holocaust. Other several thousand Jews were abusively and forcibly resettled to other Northern Transylvanian settlements, and there were casualties here as well. The second phase, identified by me, the Holocaust by bullet phase, these deportations were organized by Hungarian military and civil authorities during 1941 and 1942 as well. And these deportations affected already the entire territory of Northern Transylvania. We have now evidences, documents proving this situation. Even before Hungary's entering into the war against the Soviet Union on June 27, 1941, the National Central Alliance Control Authority, the KEOK, dramatically increased its activity. Plans were prepared to resettle the Alliance Jews, the so-called Alliance Jews, to the Soviet territories in Galicia. Pretext for this expulsions were to remove the so-called Polish and Russian Jews from the national territory who infiltrated in Hungary, and after the occupation of Poland by Germany in 1939, and then following the German attack against the Soviet Union in on June 22, 1941. Actions carried out by KEOK, Hungarian Gendarmerie, and Hungarian Army, with the knowledge of all the ministers involved, including Minister of the Interior Ferenc Keresztes Fischer, including Prime Minister László Bárdossy and Regent Horthy Miklós. More than 20,000 Jews were deported from Hungary throughout Körösmező and Tatar Pass to Galicia, to Kolomia, in fact, and Kamenets-Podolsky, and over 16,000 of them were shot in the head or machine gunned into mass graves or into the Dniester River, mainly near Kamenets-Podolsky on August 27 to 28, 1941. Between 10,000 to 15,000 of them were victims from Hungary. The action was carried out by the 320th SS Police Battalion belonging to the Einsatzgruppe C under the command of SS Obergruppenführer Friedrich August Jekyll. Mutilated victims were also identified on the spot, or persons, as I mentioned, already shot into the Dniester River or killed by other means. The most affected northern Transylvanian Jewish communities, I give you here a list, and I considered very necessary and opportune to present here to you not only the Hungarian and Ukrainian and other Russian or other names, but also the former Jewish name of each settlement, the former Yiddish name. So Tisza-Karácsonyfalva, called Krecsniv in Yiddish or Crăciunești in Romanian. 400 people were entrained in a single day and deported in 1941 throughout Mezőhát, which is Lazeshchina now in Ukraine, to Kamenets-Podolsky. The majority were murdered there. Máramaros-sziget, or Sziget in Yiddish, Szigetumár Maciei in Romanian, 450 people deported to Kamenets-Podolsky in July 1941. The majority were murdered there. Szatmárnémeti, called in Yiddish Szakmer or Satmer, and Szatumár in Romanian, over 1,000 people deported to Kamenets-Podolsky in July 1941. Felső-Apsa, Ober-Apsa or Apsa de Sus, over 800 people deported to Kamenets-Podolsky under and other Ukrainian Jewish ghettos, the majority also murdered. And the list continues with Alsó-Apsa, 217 people, Bustyaháza, 650 people, Dombó, 120 people, and other Jews rounded up in different northern Transylvanian counties, such as Bihar County in Nagyvárad, in Kolozsvár, in Marosvásár, in Beszterce, and in the secular countries as well, and were deported to Galicia. The total of approximately 1,500 people. Their great majority was killed in Kamenets-Podolsky, in Transnistria, in Kolomea, or in other ghettos of Ukraine. And their vast majority of those deported, for example, from the secular counties, from Kolozs, Bihar County, and other counties from southeastern or southern part of the northern Transylvania area, were all Hungarian citizens, rounded up only because they had political views which were not accepted by the Horthy regime. We have here total of these deportations ordered from Budapest, generating a total of 4,000 to 5,000 Jewish victims only from northern Transylvania. This was the first big-scale mass murder of the Shoah in Hungary. The third phase of the northern Transylvanian Holocaust was, of course, the labor service, which started also in northern Transylvania as in Hungary generally. The legal basis was the decree of the Ministry of the Interior, signed by Prime Minister László Bardossy in April 16, 1941. Affected all the Jews of military age who were forced to serve an auxiliary labor service of 2 years. During the summer of 1942, call-up of Jews from northern Transylvania for labor service began, around 15,000 northern Transylvanian Jewish labor servicemen were sent first to Hungarian labor camps and then to the front lines in Ukraine. And due to the inhuman treatment, the insufficient food, the disease, the mass murders which took place here, and the war and injuries, a great number of them never returned home. So by the end of the war, others were taken prisoners by the Soviets and increased more the number of victims. At least 2/3 of the northern Transylvanian labor servicemen perished during the labor service or in massacres like that one happened in Dorosic, where on the morning of April 29, 1943, Hungarian military set on fire the epidemic typhoid field hospital, killing 468 labor servicemen, and another more than 50 were machine gunned when they tried to escape from the fire. Because these atrocities, because the war actions and the Soviet captivity, the number of victims increased to at least 2/3 of the total number of 15,000, around 15,000 Jewish labor servicemen of northern Transylvania. We have the fourth phase, a summary of it. The fourth phase, the deportations after the German occupation in March 19th, 1944. It is important to discuss what happened in March 18th, 1944. The gentleman from Florida put that question earlier with the number of Jews who survived until March 18th. So March 18th was a dark day for the Jews of northern Transylvania as well, because Regent Miklos Horthy agreed on this pact with Adolf Hitler to hand over 300,000 or more Jews for the so-called war production purposes to Germany, and to appoint a pro-Nazi prime minister, which will be Döme Stolyai, and a government in favor of the Nazi Germany with state secretaries like László Endre and László Baki, who will be responsible for the tragedy of the Hungarian Jewry. Of course, during this Horthy Hitler negotiation in Schloss Glassheim on March 18th, one of the most important aspects in Horthy's agenda were his dynastic ambitions. 19th of May 1944, Hungary was occupied by German forces. The SS Sonderkommando of Eichmann arrived in Budapest, and by the end of March, internment of several hundreds of the wealthiest and most influential northern Transylvania's Jews in Hungarian concentration camps took place. Legislation and action for expropriation were the same as in Hungary. I listed there a few for you. Hungarian authorities were very eager to start and rapidly execute the mass deportation program. As you probably all of you know, this part of the deportations: robbery of Jewish valuables and deportation of Jews organized in a far more efficient and professional manner than during the previous phases of the Northern Transylvanian Holocaust, and the April 27, 1944 decree of the Minister of Public Supply, saying that by May 1st, all Jews had to submit their personal data to the mayor's office of their settlements in order to obtain their new food allocation documents. This list serves later as basic inventories to round up and put in the ghetto every single Jewish person living in northern Transylvania. The ghettoization, the ghettoization and deportation drive started with the conferences on which they prepared the main ghetto points for the ghettos in northern Transylvania. You have here the so-called gendarmerie districts. Here you have a map with 3 gendarmerie districts, that of Maramuresh, that of Szeklerland, and of the rest of the northern Transylvanian counties. The main ghettos and deportation points in northern Transylvania are listed here, and the trains departing or passing throughout the Kassa railway station according to the Kassa railway log are with their starting points are listed also here. We have a total number of deported persons of 131,658 according to this log from Kassa, but also I would like to draw your attention on the fact that 7 transports were not recorded on the Kassa log. We don't know exactly the number of those deported. As a conclusion, I have to state that the total number of Jews deported from northern Transylvania was at least 135,000. The maximum number of northern Transylvanian survivors of the Holocaust thus was 35 to 40,000 persons. The minimum number of northern Transylvanian victims in all 4 phases of the Holocaust is between 125,000 and 130,000. In southern Transylvania was a totally different situation. 42,000 individuals were considered Jew under enacted Romanian racial legislation. They had also to face labor service in labor camps listed here, and deportations to Transnistria, even if Romanian history was denying these deportations of southern Transylvanian Jews to Transnistria until now. Plans for deportation to German-occupied Poland of southern Transylvanian Jews also were on the agenda in 1942, but saved by a conjoined effort of 3 important persons of the southern Transylvanian community. Expulsion of the Jews of Sighisoara, it's a another very important issue. They were expelled from Romania to northern Transylvania and deported to Auschwitz-Birkenau from the ghetto of Marosvásárhely in May 1944. Executions carried out by Hungarian army during the attack of September 1944, another diminish of the southern Transylvanian Jewish community in Szermás, Nagysármás, 120 6 victims, in Ludus or Marosludas 17 victims, and in Árpád 6 victims. So the total number of lost lives in southern Transylvania was between 1,000 and 2,000, and the conclusion that 4/5 of the northern Transylvanian Jews, representing 2/3 of the full Transylvanian Jewry, perished in the Holocaust. Together with many other Hungarians, I myself shared the never-ending pain of the survivors and their relatives, and we are mourning today, as always, together with the Jewish people. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for 3 very interesting papers. I'm going to take a few minutes to say something about the papers, and then I know we want to get to questions. So I'm going to go in reverse order, and I'll begin with a few thoughts about Dr. Tibor Szabó's paper, who give us a very fine overview of the destruction of northern Transylvanian Jewry. And I want to underscore 2 of the many important issues that he raises in his paper. First, I want to draw your attention to the fact that he begins his account in the fall of 1940, just weeks after Hungary re-annexed the northern part of Transylvania. Fixing the starting point here has profound implications for our interpretation of the period, of the perpetrators, and of what motivated them. As Hungarian authorities began to reintegrate northern Transylvania into Hungary, into the Hungarian state, through a host of nationalizing, or if you like, renationalizing policies, they also began to abuse, expel, and deport Jews from this border region. So renationalizing the territory, making policies to integrate it to make it more exclusively Hungarian territory, also went hand in hand with expelling the unwanted. Second, Dr. Tibor Szabó reminds us that the expulsion of Jews from Transylvania, which began in the fall of 1940 and which included the much larger deportations of 1941, were carried out under the pretext that the victims were aliens and not citizens. But this was a false distinction, as he shows us, and he shows in the paper in more detail, deliberately manipulated by Hungarian authorities. Many of the victims had been born in the region but were unable to document their citizenship, and sometimes these documents did not exist, but in other cases, Hungarian authorities took their cue from decades of anti-Semitic rhetoric that defined Jews as foreign and intentionally refused to release the documents. So this should remind us that the Hungarian officials, especially those in the KOH, may have talked about aliens and citizens as if they were self-evident things, but in fact they treated citizenship as a subjective and highly politicized category that could be manipulated to exclude men and women who had never known another home. Finally, and this is really a question, if one of our tasks here today is to think about the task of remembering, it's worth asking, since we have Dr. Tibor Szabó with us, about the memory of these events in Transylvania today. The history of the Holocaust is a very hotly contested issue in Hungary. Some episodes, such as the issue of reburying the writer József Nyíra, have spilled over into Transylvania, have become issues between the Hungarian and Romanian state, which leads me to ask, what has been the effect of all this on local memory of the Holocaust? What do people who live in Transylvania today make of this history, and especially of the material remnants, the synagogues, the cemeteries of people who once lived amongst them and who now are gone? Turning to Dr. Murer's paper, he gives us a consideration of the mental world. It defines the subculture of the Hungarian radical right. He talks about fantasies of hate as ways to form group identity. And as his survey work reveals, a belief that violence can be an effective and legitimate form of social communication strongly correlates with Jobbik support for the Jobbik party, especially among young people in Hungary. He suggests we should see a connection between the acts of violence and intimidation committed by radical rightists against Roma men and women, and the marches and rallies and militaristic self-presentation of the young men in the various right radical guards. All of these phenomena can be understood as a kind of symbolic politics that ties anxieties about social mobility to a shared sense of suffering, loss, and outrage at presumed crimes, both large and small, committed against true Hungarians. Violence, therefore, has a psychological function. It helps to stabilize and define what is truly Hungarian. But this fascinating report that he's given us should push us, I think, to think a little bit further about this relationship between the psychology of the radical right and the anxieties that fuel it. And so I have three questions for all of us. First, Jobbik supporters are clearly motivated in part by a sense of being left behind, economically and socially, and by a belief that the political elites care nothing for the concerns of true Hungarians. They also traffic in the broader set of historical memories of trauma that we, I think all here in this room, can use the shorthand of Trianon to describe. Yet these psychological factors can be found in many places. Some of these resentments can be filed under the title of anti-globalization. You can find them across Europe. If you put them together with the issues related to Trianon, you can find them in a much wider spectrum of the Hungarian electorate, which leads me to come back to one of the original questions Dr. Murer posed: what makes a Jobbik supporter? Why is, in fact, the extreme right so remarkably visible in Hungary today when some of these very same factors motivating them can be found in other countries and other places? Second, how can we apply these psychological insights to the difference between symbolic and physical violence? This was an issue, I think, that came up in certain ways in Gabor Kadar's paper this morning. It's certainly intimidation and hate speech to post a sticker declaring that Jews don't belong at universities, but it's not quite the same thing as attacking Roma men in a village. And so we do need to think a little bit about where fantasies of hate explode into physical violence. How, where, when, the context in which this happens. Finally, we saw a lot of photographs of the Magyar Garda and men in young men in paramilitary uniforms. But if you look at the Jobbik website, the party website, you'll see pictures there of attractive young people, men and women, who are basically indistinguishable from other Europeans. And so I want to ask us how we can think about a social psychological model of hatred that can be made flexible enough to account for some of these differences in region, in class, in gender, that seem to be at work in Hungary today. Finally, Árpád von Klimó discusses the case of the Catholic Church since 1989. He cautions us against seeing contemporary religious politics in Hungary as a simple continuation of Horthy-era Christian nationalism. Most crucially, the 1965 encyclical Nostra Aetate fundamentally redefined church teaching about Judaism. And public statements from church leaders such as Cardinal Erdő certainly reflect this, and if András Kovács's polling data are correct, they seem to have penetrated into lay members of the church as well. At the same time, though, Hungarian Catholics, both clergy and lay, have looked back to the close relationship between church and state that prevailed during the interwar years as they try to renew Catholic life in the present. And like many others, they too are sifting through that period to try to find a usable past that can guide them in the future. And this process of remembering raises questions about who can speak in the name of the Church and of Catholicism and who cannot. Professor von Klimó gives us the example of the blogger József Bálint, whose views I'm sure the Catholic hierarchy, if they actually read the website, would certainly publicly reject. But debates between the religious and secular right and between clergy and lay people over the correct way to interpret the role of the Church during this Horthy period comes into sharpest focus if we consider the case of the exceptionally talented and influential Bishop Ottokar Prohászka, who is both a reformer and exceptionally talented and charismatic pastor, but who is also, let us be frank, a racist who gave decisive support to anti-Semitic legislation. Since 1989, the Church has called for a thorough reconsideration of Prohászka's spiritual legacy as a visionary whose views about matters like pastoral training and the use of the vernacular in liturgy anticipated the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in many ways. But the far right, Jobbik, have also rediscovered Bishop Prohászka, the Bishop Prohászka whose Hungarist ideology of national self-defense against alien Jewish influence was venerated in the 1930s after Prohászka's death by Arrow-Cross fascists. Both of these initiatives commemorate the very same man, and the struggle to define this legacy is fierce. So the debate about Prohászka, the question of the church and its role in contemporary politics and its look to the past to find a usable future, reminds us of an important truth. It's impossible to sort through the history of the Horthy period and separate the comforting aspects from those that remain profoundly troubling. The two are intertwined in the historical record. I want to stop there, and in a moment we'll follow the same question and answer format that we had before the break. But before I do, I know he's on a very tight schedule. I would very much like to call on Ambassador Pröhle, if he is here. I have the glare in my eyes, I can't see anything. If you ask him if he would like to say anything before we turn to the general question.
After answering the your questions, so it's not so urgent.
Okay, very good. Would we like to collect questions first? Yes, maybe from, and so again, please come down, state your name, and speak into the microphone either on this side or that side of the room.
My name is John Van Til. I'm Professor Emeritus at Rutgers Camden, and I will begin a term as Fulbright Specialist next month at the University of Jewish Studies in Budapest. My question has to do with the upcoming election in only 2.5 weeks in Hungary. Árpád, you have used very well blogs in your research, and Jeffrey, you have used pictures very well in your research. I want to mention a very useful website in English, which is politics.hu, politics.hu. And I would invite the audience to follow that website and be researchers with the rest of us, particularly up until the election, because the commentary that follows this rather fair, broad-based recounting of news in Hungary in English, I find very interesting. And one will see a very vehement anti-Semitic and anti-Gypsy comments on there, and one will see very liberal and pluralist and democratic comments on there, and one can follow the events. But I wonder, particularly Árpád and Jeffrey, if you could tell us where this website actually comes from, who puts it together, and if you don't know, do you have perhaps a surmise as to where it might come from?
I thought we
Yeah, we're collecting, yes, I'm sorry.
There's another.
Yeah, okay, please.
My name is Jeff Blum. This is particularly for Dr. Murer. Are there evidences of Roma Jewish embracing of their shared exclusion, and evidences of any political party or parties or other organizations embracing the Jewish past and saying, yes, we are Jewish, it is part of Hungary, and in that way re-including the Jews in Hungary?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, perhaps we can address those two, and then maybe, do you want to come to the microphone? Please do.
It's not 100% on topic, but my uncle Bela Elek was one of Raoul Wallenberg's main helpers. Wallenberg left him in charge of Hegyes Halom on the border, and he brought back, actually Bishop helped him, but he would bring back maybe 200 people at a time. From what I've heard, because he was murdered by the Holocaust in Nyílás, from what I've heard, that even before Wallenberg came, there were people who left, for instance, my mother's family was from Kasia in Slovakia. They would come to Hungary, and some of them were able to get documentation that they left that area because they were persecuted as Hungarians. And I heard from my uncle's, while I spoke with his late fiancée, that he would be able to get people papers saying that this is before the Hungarian Jews were deported, that they would have documentation saying we're in Hungary because we were persecuted in Slovakia, well, then Czechoslovakia, as being Hungarians. Well, I want to know if you were familiar with that, and I want to know more about it, because there's virtually nothing written on it, or I've just heard it from one person. Thank you.
So then why don't you take those questions in turn and just go there, and then we'll get another set.
Oh,
later.
that's
So go
great.
ahead.
No. I mean, really important questions, and in some sense, some of these tie to, thank you, to some of Paul's questions. Let me take the middle one. I mean, I think that this idea of recognition of something shared, particularly among, say, some of the Roma and Jewish activists, this notion of cooperation against oppression. And I would say that this also goes across other political parties, some of the other political supports, whether someone wants to characterize that as being from the left, or a position of social democracy, or a position of inclusion. But the idea that there would be something articulated, I think was particularly pronounced in these attacks in March and April of 2011 in Jungerspata, where the Jewish community went out to Jungerspata along with other protesters to actually say, you know, we are going to be part of the defense of this Roma village. And I think understanding this kind of connection between the attacks on one community can be interpreted as an attack on the other, I think is quite important, to not see that divide, to somehow say, oh, well, that's not our problem, that's the other community's problem. I mean, I think if there's a lesson that's learned from the Holocaust, it's certainly the notion of the necessity for solidarity in that regard. I would say also, in this sense, maybe we can take some of these questions in turn. You know, one of the problems in Hungary in particular, and this was one of Paul's questions, like how is it different in Hungary, is one of the issues of tying a lot of this politics to Trianon, so that it's not explicitly a Holocaust or World War II discourse. And in fact, many of the far right in Hungary, right, they will actively denounce any association with Nazis, right, because Nazis are Germans. So this isn't a German problem, this is a Hungarian problem, according to the far right. So they're quite happy to actually denounce Nazism while still embracing, say, fascism or you know, racialist revanchism. But then we start to move into the language of political scientists rather than the discourses for themselves. But I think this idea then of having a narrative that's seen as legitimate, that's tied back to Trianon, and in a way that the Roma, unfortunately this is a European problem, are kind of a target that a lot of people don't get bothered about. The idea that the Italian government can remove Roma communities from outside the train stations in Milan, right? That the French government can remove Roma in mass deportations, putting people on airplanes and flying them back to Romania regardless of whether they came from Romania. This is actually a European problem where, say, other parties that maybe like Jobbik, and I don't mean Jobbik so much as some of these activists, these direct action groups, say Golden Dawn, they're attacking immigrants. Well, that's not liberal European politics, right? That's off the page. So I think part of the issue of legitimacy and the visibility in Hungary is partially because of their selection of narrative that's seen as a legitimate one, and then in a way their selection of target, which unfortunately, especially for Roma activists, is also seen as the legitimate one.
Keep going. Okay, so would you like to ask your question, or do you want to, anyone else want to?
First, I just like to comment. I'd like to comment on politics.hu. It is founded by Eric D'Amato. It's a prominent American journalist who is living in Hungary, and he's the chief editor of the site. And I have a question to Mr. Stevenson. You mentioned the far-right ideology, and I would like to ask you if you don't feel that the same rhetorics appearing in the government party side. So that's why I'd like to quote Prime Minister Viktor Orbán on the 25th Congress of Fidesz. He said, honey-tongued bankers, the large international monopolies, their supporters among the bureaucrats of Brussels, and their domestic warlords. So I think that it's a kind of reminding us to the far-right rhetorics. So what's your point on that? Thank you.
Sir.
My name is Martin Weiss. I am from Transylvania, actually, originally, and so I'm somewhat familiar with what you mentioned, Mr. Sabo, or Dr. Sabo. I would like to point out something that you mentioned, but I think you didn't cover that part. As far as I'm concerned, the Hungarians never had to face, like the Germans had to face it, and they changed their habits. Germany today is not the same Germany as it was yesterday. Hungary never had to go through that and to face the music. And the reason I mention this, I know for a fact, like those people that were shipped out earlier, that were supposedly not citizens, whom I knew, saw quite a number of them, and they were dumped up, they were taken out to Ukraine, and they were left, and they were mostly shot, and they endured some hardships before they were killed and so on. But the point I want to make is that when the Hungarian troops now on that part of in the Ukraine, or the Russian front, also threw in women and children into the Dniester River on a daily basis. And the reason I know some people from the Munkatábor were there, and I had a cousin that was there, so it was not a hearsay, it was fact. They would take the children, literally tear them away from the mothers, and this was not the Germans, this was Hungarians. They would bash their heads in on a rock, and the mother was bleeding, and only then they would throw in the mother. And this is the kind of brutality they practiced. Now, not to leave out Budapest, we were still home, and I used to hear stories from Budapest, plus I had some friends that lived in Budapest at the time. They took women and children on a daily basis, thrown into the Danube towards the end when the Nyilasas were there. And all this stuff is buried, nobody ever talks about it, and then they talk about the Jews. I mean, give me a break. Nobody talks about the Hungarians. I mean, it's something the Germans had to take, they had to swallow the pill, and they had to change. The Hungarians were not. And you go not only Hungary, I could take Romania, you take a lot of the other countries, Lithuania, every one of them is guilty. Half of the Gestapo was Lithuanians. The murderers were Ukrainians in the camps. Nobody ever talks about that. Everybody's ashamed to say it. And those are facts. So I would like to see what you have to say something about just a Hungarian facing the music.
Thank you very much. Perhaps we could have some brief responses to those two questions, and then...
Can I say something to the last point?
Yes, but please be brief in your responses.
Yeah, I think we have to make a big difference between Germany and Hungary with regard to the Holocaust. Germany was organizing the Holocaust all over Europe. Without Germany, there would not have been Holocaust anywhere else. So Hungary was involved in it, but it's a different case, I think. It's not the same thing. And I say this as a German.
I would like to remind you that I used several times the formulation that the Hungarian army together with the Hungarian gendarmes and they deported, they rounded up, I think that I referred quite a lot to the Hungarian involvement. That the question you raised is a very important one. Why it was not such a catharsis in Hungarian society as it was in the German one. I mean, the facing of what happened during the Second World War by the German society was much more sincere that what is happening since in Hungary, or not mentioning these days. I came here today with Professor Braham and he told me about his experience in Germany, visiting the Holocaust Museum there, and he saw some high school students who were crying, in fact, after they saw some movies, and And he went. He told me that he went there and tried to comfort them and explain them that they are not guilty because they were not yet born, or their parents were not born by the moment that when the Holocaust took place. I mean, this kind of sincere facing of the truth and what happened probably will have to arrive in Hungary as well. I am very confident that it will be a day when it will be the case of Hungary as well. Thank you.
I'd just like to say something about this connection also to some of the current, say, politics. And I think part of the issue that there hasn't been a historians' debate or that kind of discussion, unfortunately, goes back to that first campaign in 1990 where Czuri and Czurka took politics in a very symbolic direction that meant it wasn't necessarily a discussion about the past, and it certainly wasn't a discussion about, say, current economic situations. And I think that made it very difficult to go back and revisit some of the politics, because to do so was to suddenly become political, that it was a political stance to want to talk about one position or another. And I think here, too, we see some of the difference with some of the anti-globalization politics. I think that the questioner about the connection to the current government is onto something that's quite important. I think, unfortunately, Fidesz, particularly after some of the more centrist or more left-wing people were removed from the party very early in the 1990s, has largely seen some of its political competition as being on the right. And I think this rhetoric that's been used in the current campaign about Hungary not being colonized by bankers or by capitalism is a very dangerous one, because it starts to move into the discourse of Jobbik and the far right. I think actually to Paul's question about, you go on the Jobbik page and everyone looks very European, and they want to be in the European Parliament with some of the other kind of rightist parties. I think this was some of the brainchild of Vona creating these direct action groups, so that the political party actually looks quite respectable, and that the direct action groups are the ones that actually look like the people whose photographs I took, or who are the people that I speak with. In October, at a number of these Jobbik rallies, the speakers are talking about the financial crisis, and they're speaking in a language that may not be dissimilar from other political parties in Europe critiquing the central bank, the European Central Bank, or the Troika, or something like that. But the response from the audience, the response from these people whose photographs I took, where the person on the stage may talk about capitalism or globalization, and they talk about banker terror, right? Or they will actually shout, no, it's the Jews, it's the Jews. And you get this kind of call and response, where it seems like it's a legitimate, fine political stance coming from the podium, but it becomes a very different response from the audience. And I think that's to be listened to.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to invite again Ambassador Perla, if you'd like to say a few words. Would you like to be
Yeah.
Would you like to? Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for that excellent conference, and all the lecturers and scholars, because it's a very important event on that very important day. I think it is the day, the 70th anniversary of the German occupation. It's still a very important day. It seems to be, obviously. Otherwise, we wouldn't have organized the conference on that day. So it's important to remember in whatever way. And because of that, I think that all contributions are very important. And I am really grateful to the Holocaust Memorial Museum, but all the scholars to make their contributions. It's of course not easy for a Hungarian government official to react on every fact or every interpretation we could hear this afternoon and this morning. I would like to underline that I'm very much happy to represent a country with one of the largest Jewish community in Europe, with a very vivid Jewish life, with a Jewish Renaissance, and with all the debates we have, with all the discussions. The question about the differences between Germany and Hungary, it's always very important. I used to be ambassador of Hungary to Germany, so I know the country quite well, and I'm very grateful for the comments of Professor Klimó, because all these discussions need time. And 25 years just since the political changes, it's not a long time. So because of that, we are happy for about every initiative, every comment, because I think, and we think, that in a pluralistic society, what we have, thank God, it is normal that we have discussions about all that issues, and we have probably sometimes different views on that, and we have to listen to each other, and we have to try listen to the other one's interpretation, because it's also very important. Ladies and gentlemen, of course, my happiness about the presence of the Jewish community in Hungary is combined with a deep sadness because of the anti-Semitic actions and declarations in my country. It is, as we all know, not a specialty of Hungary. We can see that all over the world, even in the US, but also in the wealthiest European countries. And because of that, it's very important to raise awareness about that, to plan joint actions to combat anti-Semitism, and to speak very openly about the background. It's not enough to complain. It's not enough to say how bad it is that we have these paramilitary groups. And of course in Hungary that is a shortcoming for all political parties and governments, as it is in many other countries in the last decades. And if the Hungarian government nowadays initiates and is initiated already the Holocaust Memorial Year action, when we modified the civil law, when we started the campaign against paramilitary groups. So they are very important initiatives and very innovative initiatives after many, many failures of the last decades. Of course, they can't be automatically successful. So we still have many bad signs of anti-Semitism. Of course, the political anti-Semitism is present. Even because of that, it's very important to see the outcome and wait for the outcome of the next parliamentary elections in 3 weeks. That's probably the most important issue. To get the voters of Jobbik back to the parliamentary, to the democratic camp of voters, because that could be the only way to strengthen the democratic society and to save all those values which are very important for all of us. Ladies and gentlemen, in my capacity as the head of delegation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the Hungarian delegation, it's of course my very special task to plan the Hungarian chairmanship. That would be my pleasure to do that with the Holocaust Memorial Museum together. We should find common topics, because I can really assure you there is no new interpretation of history. That's no new interpretation of the Treaty of Trianon. There is a clear declaration from the Hungarian government many times on different levels, head of state, members of the Orbán government, other government officials, that Hungary recognize the responsibility of the Hungarian state in the Holocaust. It should be very clear. And because of that, I think it's important not to let Jobbik and the far right dominate all these questions, because even Trianon is a very important historical issue, but not the historical issue is important, but the rights of the Hungarians living abroad. That's very important. That belongs also to the catalogue of values which are important not just in Hungary, but even to the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to repeat my recognition. Thank you very much for your presence, and I think it's very important that we do everything we can together to combat anti-Semitism and plan together the Hungarian IRA chairmanship. Thank you very much.